Greetings, hello. This presentation is in regards to general adaptation syndrome. Now, the general adaptation syndrome, many times referred to as GAS, is pretty much the foundation for everything we do as movement practitioners, whether it's phase 3 cardiac rehab, working with somebody who maybe had a valve replacement, or somebody who twisted their ankle and we're working on prehab rehab modalities, or working with athletes to try to make them better athletes. In essence, what you're doing is you're applying a stressor to the human body, and you're looking for and attempting to have a predictable, if you will, training response to the stimuli you're placing upon the human organism. So real quick, just to go over team building. I made some changes for some of you in the class. Some of you had some specific needs regarding your workouts. Made a few changes just to make sure everything was okay. To that end, I hope your workouts are okay. We're going to definitely look at making some adjustments as we go through the term. Also, when we get into this lecture today, we're going to talk a little bit about stressors placed upon the body, and I want you to kind of view your workouts now as more of a stressor placed on the body and how your body responds to that stressor. Here we go. So with general adaptation syndrome, it really is. It's the foundation for a lot of what we do as movement practitioners. And it was originally observed by a gentleman by the name Hans Selye, and it's a way to have a body, and in his case, he was evaluating a single-celled organism, and he was evaluating how that single-celled organism adapted, more accurately reacted to a stressor that was placed upon it. And in his situation, he basically took a single-celled organism and applied an electrical shock to the single-celled organism, and he just observed the results. So this is real basic kind of layman's terms here. I don't want to get too far into it. But what he found was if you had the adequate amount of stimuli and you had the adequate amount of frequency, you would have an adaptation response to the stimuli, the electrical stimulus. If the stimulus was too great or too frequent, the organism died. If it was too low of a stimuli, the organism would only adapt so far, and then it would basically only adapt so far and just become stagnant at that point. So just the right amount was kind of like that perfect amount to get a response in a single-celled organism and not kill it off. So when you look at this, this is real basic terms, you have 3 stages are generally outlined in textbooks, etc. I like to throw in that you have this homeostasis that you have to pay attention to as a practitioner. You have to evaluate where the person is at rest, and then when you apply a training stimulus or any kind of stimulus to the person, it's how their body responds to the stimuli. So it'll go through, in this case with a single-celled organism, an alarm stage, you had a resistance stage, and too much it was an exhaustion stage. So what you're really seeking here is this just right Goldilocks amount where you apply just the right amount of stimuli to get the response you want, but not so much where you actually overburden the person. Now, some training protocols require people to, in essence, overtrain, but the overtraining is offset by prehab rehab protocols, ice baths, proper nutrition, massage therapy, etc. But you'll actually take athletes through a supercycle or a mesocycle that is an overtraining mesocycle and force their bodies to overcompensate through prehab rehab modalities. And we'll talk more about that in the class. But just for right now, just kind of get these 4 stages down, and many times 3 that you'll see in textbooks. Now, there are positive stressors, there are negative stressors. And when you look at work, family, home, school, workouts, these are all different types of stressors that are placed upon you, the college student. So many of you work, many of you have family concerns and issues if you're living at home. You perhaps have car payments and insurance payments that you have to address. And just by mere fact that you're watching this video, you have a stressor placed on you from school. And if you're able to manage these, it works out great. But sometimes they get out of balance and they become negative stressors. Work becomes too much, you have a very poor working situation because of a boss, and it becomes a negative work environment or a negative stressor. And those are kind of things that really play on and play into when you're training athletes and working with people in a prehab rehab setting, is that you do have these negative stressors that kind of creep into the training response cycle. A great example is when I was coaching in college, I would work with athletes, and it was absolutely silly to have me or have them do a 1 rep test out protocol during finals week. It was just silly. Their stress levels were already through the roof because they were trying to prepare for their final exams, and then I'm going to ask them to come in and do 1 rep test out, a very high stressful environment for training. No, 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 no. So what we did is we would actually program in and have them do their test outs the week before finals week. And then one year it worked out really well where we had 2 weeks before, and then we had them do kind of an active recuperation week leading into finals week. So it allowed them to uncouple from the training stressors and really plug back into the educational and school stressors. So you have to be able to balance these and measure these, balance these and weigh these and be able to understand that they can be positive or negative. So when you look at just kind of like test questions and quizzes, when I write my check for learning, you'll see like in question number 27, based on what we learned in class, there are 3 stages in a general adaptation syndrome, true or false. Well, you would then have to say false because I like to include the homeostasis phase. I talked about that in this lecture a little bit earlier, so that's false. But then you move on to question number 39, and please correctly choose the 4 stages of the general adaptation syndrome. So when you have a second order question like this, where you have a prep question and then a second question that relates back to the first question, that second step question allows you to basically cross-reference. So you can go back and cross-reference in number 27 based upon what you see in number 39. I bring this up because mine is not the only class you're taking. You're going to have other instructors who do this. So use your tests as a tool to be able to help you, pass your test and do really well. Now, what I want to get across is this. When you look at the single-celled organism versus the human organism, as I many times will refer to it in class, you can juxtaposition 2 things, the single-celled versus the human organism. On the left side, you have an electrical stimulus. On the right side, a training stimulus. Many of you are doing sprint technique. We're doing running drills. We're doing short bursts, also some longer conditioning. And then you have strength training as well. On the left side, you have an adaptation to the electrical stimulus. On the right-hand side, the human organism will respond with a physiological response. You'll get stronger, you'll get faster, your cardiorespiratory system will be able to process better, and you get more flexible from doing stretching drills. So on the left-hand side, you had too little, very low adaptation. On the right side, too low, you'll have an undertrained response. You won't have the optimal adaptation to training. If you have too high of a stimuli, whether it's too frequent or too high of a voltage, if you will, the single-cell organism would perish. If it's too much over on the right-hand side, the person won't drop dead from overtraining. Some people have experienced very much acute rhomboidosis, which is a whole other issue seen in very high-end, very aggressive style training. But you'll see an overtrained response, classical overtrained response, which we'll talk about later in class. And if you have just the right amount, you'll have the adequate adaptation, but on the human organism side, it's the expected training response. So as a practitioner, I program in rep and set combinations and training parameters and load parameters, and I'm expecting a training response based upon the person in front of me. Now, as we'll see, there are different types of body types, different types of people who have greater chronological age, perhaps have a greater training age, perhaps are pound for pound very explosive versus their peers. And so there's nuances to this, but what you look for is having the just right Goldilocks amount to get the training response that you are trying to elicit. And so in this case, what we often refer to very loosely, but it's periodization, it's program design. And program design through the periodization prism, if you will, it is the scientific manipulation of rep and set combinations or a training stimulus to get the training response you want, basically maximizing results while minimizing an overtrained environment and minimizing the risk of injuries, which oftentimes happens in an overtrained adaptation response environment. So you look at this and you go, okay, really, when you look at the human organism versus a single-celled organism in general adaptation syndrome, we're applying the stimulus to the human organism and trying to get a training response based upon that. We're trying to get that Goldilocks just right. And then you start to ask, okay, well, shoot, what is or are some of the training stimuli we're talking about? And We look at strength training with weights, with dumbbells, with kettlebells, any kind of implement you can think of, and there's many of them. Even your own body weight while doing push-ups is a strength training protocol. Olympic weightlifting, where you're doing snatch, clean and jerk, push presses, those are all exercises that are very, very explosive in nature, and they have a very, very high force production type of curve to them. And it's a little bit different than traditional bodybuilding and strength training. Plyometrics, more explosive oriented, cardiovascular conditioning versus sprint training, and also flexibility. Those are all types of training stimuli. And we're even seeing some of that in the class already, where we're seeing use of medicine balls, use of bands, use of dumbbells, barbells, doing some box jumps, sprinting out on the track, doing more conditioning. And what ends up happening is you view this as now these are all different types of training protocols, or more accurately, a training stimuli that you're placing to the human organism or placing on the human organism to try to get a training response. And as we'll see in this class later on, sometimes these do not run together very well. Doing long, slow 5-mile runs and trying to do Olympic weightlifting are on opposite ends of the spectrum. Trying to do sprint work and bodybuilding might not be the best two things to pair with each other, because they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. And we'll talk more about that in depth in the class, but realize if you have a particular sport or something you're training for, and the terminology for this is specificity in training, if you have a specific sport or endeavor that you're training for, you have to train properly for that sport, meaning you have to apply the proper stimuli to you, the human organism, to get the training response you want. If you're a baseball player, you need to train for your particular sport of baseball. If you're a football player, you train for football. If you want to be in shape and lose weight, you have to train and work out in a particular way to have the proper training stimulus and in the proper amount to get the response you want with the maximum amount of results while minimizing the risk of injury. All right, guys, have a good one. I'm signing off, and I look forward to our next presentation. Thanks all.